This is one of those wonderful stories that is so easy to relate to in a human way. Who hasn't, at least temporarily, experienced the worry or panic that goes with not knowing where a child is that you are responsible for, that you care about? And Jesus' parents probably had an extreme case of anxiety with a whole day before they realized he was missing. A lot can happen in a day. And you also cannot also kind of relate to Jesus in the story, who is an early adolescent. Actually, at 12 years old, Judaism would start to give a young man the responsibilities in the religious community of an adult when they were 13. So he was kind of right on the cusp of a transition into a different role, a different status in life. And as an adolescent, here he was asserting some of his independence. We can see him starting to think for himself, and we all probably can remember times when we were going through our adolescence and starting to think for ourselves and be asserting our independence, sometimes to the consternation of our parents. So it's a very human story. It's interesting that in between the stories about the infant Jesus and the adult Jesus, maybe we could extend the infant stories out into a toddler a little bit from the Gospel of Matthew. But other than that, this is the only glimpse that we have of Jesus between roughly around his non-speaking years up to when he, 30 years later, emerges for his public ministry. And it's interesting because this story is the one where we first hear Jesus speak for himself. His first words in any of the gospel traditions, the earliest ones, are from this story, and he asks questions. Why? Why are you seeking me? Why are you looking for me? Didn't you know? I had to be in my Father's house. So it's interesting from that perspective, but it's also a little bit of a glimpse of what in a narrative sense, of what the church would later on affirm about Jesus' identity, that he was fully human and fully divine. So you see Jesus going through kind of a normal adolescent experience of trying to work on forming his identity. Who is he? What was most important to him? It's an important phase for people to go through. We kind of grow up kind of following in a pattern that our parents have set for us. We start to get a little bit more awareness of choice and options. We start to exert them. Thankfully, for a few years, things calm down and parents have fairly, complacent, obedient children. And then we start thinking and realizing that things don't have to be just exactly the way our parents have laid them out for us. And we see Jesus emerging with this awareness that he needs to figure some things out for himself. But he does it in such an interesting way because even as he's having this very human developmental experience, he seems to be strongly and urgently attuned to a relationship with God that is almost surpassing and independent of his parents. And it's just a glimpse of what the church could, as best it could try to put into words, call fully human and fully divine in one person, Jesus Christ, the Son, the second person of the Trinity. So this story, I think, has some wonderful insights for us in our time, in a sense, because I think our day and age forces us to be about identity formation all throughout our lives. Our world, if you think about it, is so saturated with choices and options and possibilities all around us all the time, and advertising and people showing us, oh, this is what life looks like, this is what a fulfilled life looks like, this is what it looks like. Images proliferate all around us, and much the way I feel like when I go into a mall, absolutely overwhelmed by choice. Anybody else have that feeling? In a way, our media-saturated environment makes that question before us all the time. In a sense, we really, baby boomers, are still saying, what do I want to be when I grow up? Because possibilities are always put before us, and images of what our fulfillment might be. So I think it's helpful, actually, to revisit Jesus' story and think about the careful way he was working out who he was and who he would be through this little episode. Now, there is an interesting two options of translations of the passage of Jesus' questions, because the question that he asked, didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? How many of you have mostly heard that? I had to be in my Father's house. The old King James Version translates it as, I had to be about my Father's business. Anybody familiar with that version? And both of those translations are really kind of equally valid, because the Greek word for house is not there. It's kind of ambiguous. The phrasing in Greek is, didn't you know I had to be about my Father? And then translators have filled in what made most sense of the story and the context. And some of them have said, you know what? My Father's house makes a lot of sense, because Jesus actually really talks about the temple as God's house. Remember when he clears the temple, my Father's house is meant to be a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves. He also talks about the temple as God's house. And Father was a term that Jesus used quite predominantly when he was speaking about God. So translators have filled it in, didn't you know I needed to be in my Father's house? But there's also some sense in which it makes sense to say about my Father's business, because this is a time when he's deciding who he is and who he's going to be, and that's very much related to what you do. Being and doing are very closely related. And we can see that when Jesus has clarity about who he is, what he does flows from that. So in this episode, we see Jesus coming to terms with the most fundamental aspects of who he is, because that will dictate what he does. So what can we pull from it? Number one, this kind of jumps out to me because the one story that is being told of Jesus' adolescence has him going to the temple. So I want to suggest that one of the things that this story is teaching us is that it's really important to put ourselves in positions regularly where we're contemplating and having time to simply be in God's presence. In a busy world, that can kind of feel like a waste of time. Oftentimes when I think and read and start to meditate and pray, I get this voice coming in my head, oh, don't just sit there, do something. And that's an important voice, but it gets so loud that it can block out all of the thinking and the awe and the revelation that goes along with the time of being in a space of meditation. Contemplation actually means with the temple, contemplar. Going to the temple doesn't necessarily mean coming to the church building. It means taking time to be in sacred space, in your head, in your time. In confirmation class, we had a very quick lesson when we were working on the parts of worship and what they are, and one of the ways that I opened up the conversation was to take every single part of a worship service, and from the very small things to the very large things, and there were about 15 of them, and I broke them into groups and gave them these parts of worship and said, now rank these in order of importance and get rid of ones you think are not important and put the top 5 you think are most important. And I didn't give them a whole lot of time to do it. But they had some very interesting conversations, by the way, very thoughtful. So I kind of over-listened. And had disagreements about, well, the Lord's Prayer, you just say the same thing every week. You can kind of do away with that, with somebody else saying, oh no, that's the most important thing. It was very, very interesting to hear them thinking about the different kinds of considerations that go into what makes worship true and meaningful. But the one thing that really surprised me, that was coming out of both of the groups that were working on this, and this is additionally surprising to me because it was coming from kids who, what are they always have their phones up in front of, right? They said, well, the most important part, in their top 5, both of them, was silence and time just to pray when it's quiet, which it's a little bit humbling. I could take it personally, but I didn't, because I realized they're right. And probably amazing that they were just so quickly identifying an innate need for just space, silence, time when our agendas are not intruding and cat videos aren't intruding and other things are not being so noisy in our heads. Because actually, when we quiet ourselves and go into whatever temple we have, God often shows up in subtle ways, in revealing ways. Even when God shows up in the form of helping us understand ourselves better, or someone else. So, going into the temple, I just want to put that on your busy schedules as something that will feel not productive, but will be productive. I'm reminding myself as much as you. Second thing, one of the things that would really jump out at us from this story, if we had not already heard so much New Testament language. In the Old Testament, Jesus, the scriptures refer to God as Father some, a little bit. But it's among many other images and ways of talking about God. King, and then lots of images that are based on natural phenomenon, a rock or a fortress, lots of different ways of thinking about God as in terms of physical imagery. It's Jesus way of talking about God that really switches the predominance of the metaphors, of the way that we try to image and relate to God, to a personal. Jesus is the one who pushes on us this parental image of God. If we hadn't heard all of the rest of the New Testament language before, and we're just hearing this story newly, it would have jumped out at us that Jesus says, "Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house? In my Father's house." And it's particularly poignant when Mary has just said to him, "Son, didn't you know your father and I were so worried about you?" And what does he say back? "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" And it struck me as significant because Jesus, well, for me, so oftentimes I turn to God when I need something, when I'm feeling inadequate, when I want to be forgiven or need to be forgiven, or when I'm feeling insecure, and it's really strangely utilitarian. Jesus has this urgency to connect to God simply because of the relationship. And I think as a parent, when you go through with the kids in their late 20s, lots of times the only time you do hear from them is when, "Hey Mom, I'm at the grocery store. How do you make your tuna salad casserole? I got to get this stuff right now." Or things that are all really utilitarian. And finally I said to my son one time, "Why don't you just call me sometime and so we can just say hi and hello and tell me what's going on in your day?" It's so much more meaningful that way. We'll get there. But Jesus wasn't acting out of any kind of immediate demand or need that he had from God. He had to connect with his Father. It was about the relationship with God. One of John Wesley's 3 simple rules has been summarized as stay in love with God. And this is what Jesus was doing, taking time just to develop and deepen the relationship with God. So that's something else we can draw from it. And then the last thing I think is so wise and wonderful about this story is that Jesus demonstrated an ability to allow his relationship with God, his heavenly Father, his heavenly parent, to be the most important relationship and thereby to order all of his other relationships. This is a really tricky thing to do, isn't it? We have relationships with other people in a human way we love deeply, we care about. We want to make them happy. We want to please them. We also want what is good for them. And sometimes our relationship with God can seem like it's getting in the way of that. And this story helps us see Jesus really trusting that in this instance, he is firmly putting his relationship with his heavenly Father first and foremost, and helping his parents, his earthly parents, understand their relationship with him. Even though this story sounds like a kind of rebellious adolescent story, it ends up going on in the end, I don't know if you were paying attention, to affirm that Jesus then went home with his parents after he'd caused them so much distress and was obedient to them and fulfilled his role as a good son. But he realized that the first relationship most important one was his relationship with his heavenly parent. And from that flowed a good ordering of all of the rest of his relationships. So I guess the third thing I pull from this is, it's a good reminder to kind of take an inventory of your multiple relationships with all kinds of people that you have in your families, friends, co-workers, acquaintances, and ask yourself, is there an element of just people-pleasing going on? Or could I best be in a relationship in a wholesome, loving way by first getting my relationship with God in order, and then trusting that the rest will flow from God's goodness in and through us. That's what I think Jesus was asking us to think about. And so I wish all of us in this time of transition coming into a new year to think about Jesus as our kind of model today. And God bless you. Amen.